Welcome to the Writer Reads Chronicles of a Dark God, Book 2, Dark God's Rise, Chapter 35, The Elves Arrive. Until there is no peace to be had? McGrill or Darkenoak asked in shock. No one, elemental or otherwise, dared address him so bluntly. His bloodline was one of the oldest in the capital. The Elven King's words stunned him to silence, and he took an involuntary step back as his ruler leaned toward him. "Well, Lord Darkenoak," the king asked, "what reply do you have now?" Your Highness," McGrillo stuttered, "I'm forced to concede my agreement." The king's eyes crinkled with amusement, and he glanced toward the enormous earth elemental that had twisted from the forest floor and bested McGrillo in combat, looking mollified and settled to the humus beneath its coils. It dipped its chin, and the king nodded in reply before looking at those gathered around them. "We are agreed, then," he announced, and looked once more toward the creature. "This is good." Its words sounded clearly in their heads as it rumbled its reply. "Well, Shira needs to be subdued, and quickly. The Holy Knights will not mistake your intentions, or your value as allies." McGrillo frowned. How could the big beast be sure the neighboring paladins would not mistake elven aid for a desire for closer relations? He shrugged. No matter, he thought. Any such assumption can be quickly corrected when the crisis is over. He dragged his attention back to the council in time to hear the earth elemental take its leave. "Must go and rouse my people," it said. "A suitable replacement for the old one's prison must be found." The king inclined his head in acceptance and farewell. "May the elemental lords watch over you, and may your kin find what you seek and prosperity besides," he said, giving his own twist to the formality. "And may your race rise to greatness and prosper for a millennium or more," the creature answered. The gathered elves watched it wind its way beneath the leaves, the earth accepting its passage with barely a ripple. As it disappeared, McGreelaw became aware of a soft presence at his shoulder, and looked away from the clearing's centre to see who stood there so unbidden. The elven woman at his side made his knees go weak, but her hand under his elbow prevented him from sinking to his knees. "My lady," he whispered, stumbling back into the booth he'd been granted as part of the meeting. Drawing the curtains to grant himself some privacy, he waited for the goddess to reappear at his side. "My blessed lady," he whispered, and Fianre, elven goddess of light, life, and nurture, appeared. Her mouth curled into a slight smile, and she motioned him to take one of the chairs set to either side of a small table within the booth's confines. "Have peace, Lord Darkenoak," she said softly. "This contact is for the best. Do not oppose it." Her words held both instruction and warning, but she gave him no time to argue. With another winsome smile she vanished, leaving just the faintest scent of lilacs to mark her passage. McGrillo stared at the spot she'd occupied and abruptly closed his mouth. Best for who? He wondered, but felt his worries regarding the proposed meeting with the knights ease. "Lord Darkenoak!" The king's voice startled him, and he jumped. He hastily smoothed his tunic and ran a hand through his hair. "Your Highness," he answered, drawing back the curtains and stepping clear of the booth. The king's brow creased with momentary worry. "Are you well?" McGrillo inclined his head and gave the king a slight bow. "I am well, your majesty. I apologize. I needed to gather myself after the encounter." "Then we are agreed?" the king pressed, and McGrillo nodded. "We are agreed, your highness." The king met his eyes and held them for a long moment, then sighed. "Very well, Lord Darkenoak. We will need delegates from your grove, the best you can spare." "Of course, your majesty," McGrillo replied, bowing more deeply in farewell. When he straightened, the king had already moved on to the next delegate. 2 days after Reomar's arrival, the captain of the watch was woken by a shout of alarm from the city walls. The clangor of the alarm bell followed, bringing him to full wakefulness, even as he reached for the weapons belt hanging over the chair beside his desk. His aide-de-camp arrived as he struggled to tighten the straps on his breastplate, helping him don his armor in record time. As soon as the man waved him toward the door, the captain headed out. Outside, his soldiers poured from the barracks to the central parade ground. Some were still pulling on helmets or strapping on swords, while others were grabbing quivers and bows from the open window of the armory. Into this maelstrom of action the captain strode. "Sergeant!" he roared, the cry carrying easily across the bustling parade ground. "Sir!" The sergeant's reply came back just as clearly, and he saw the man turn toward him. The captain took the last few strides needed in order to reach the man, relieved when the sergeant continued supervising the issue of weapons and the correction of armor. "Take the time to fix that strap, soldier," he shouted, pointing at the offending leather. "Now, boy, or you'll find yourself bleeding later, or dead. And you," the captain added, touching the other man's shoulder buckle as he passed, "have someone see to that before you mount the wall." As he arrived, the sergeant tapped a nearby corporal on the shoulder. "Take over, corporal," he said. "Let none up if their armor's not tight." "Yes, sergeant." He was barking orders and corrections before the sergeant drew the captain to one side. Finding an alcove at the side of the armory, the sergeant spoke. "There's a large force approaching the gate," he said. "Any idea who?" "No, sir. Just the occasional glint of helms and a multitude of lance tips barely seen through the mist. We'd have missed them if the dawn light hadn't been reflected." "Understood." The captain looked up at the wall and the men gathering there. "We'd best go take a look, see if we can work it out between us." The sergeant glanced once toward his corporal. "Keep 'em coming, Bladen, and let none up there half dressed." "You want 'em up faster, Sarge?" The sergeant shook his head. "Not yet, son. This is an alert, not an emergency." He caught the corporal's faint look of disappointment and crossed quickly to his side. Bending close to the man's ear, he growled, "And keep the men calm, corporal. I don't want them so stirred up they're not thinking." He glanced at the wall top. One stray arrow could turn a diplomatic envoy into a war, or a trade delegation into an embargo. Bear that in mind, and make sure the men do too. "Yes, sergeant," the corporal answered, reddening slightly. The sergeant took a moment to glare at him, then pivoted to join the captain. Without another word between them, the two commanders hurried toward the tower stairs. The men spaced along the battlements stiffened as they arrived, but none of them took their eyes from the scene below, and the captain and sergeant hurried to take it in for themselves. The sunrise was giving way to full day, and the mist was drifting into tatters of fading flame. If it hadn't been for the ranks of mounted knights silently arrayed before the walls, and the equally silent ranks of armored foot soldiers, the pennants hanging limp from the lances that bore them, could have been mistaken for banners at a fair. "They don't look hostile," the captain commented, observing the still sheathed weapons and the non-aggressive formations in which the troops were arrayed. He noted also the absence of siege weapons and the way the archers still had their bows slung. "There aren't that many of them either," the sergeant commented, then indicated the cluster of robed individuals surrounding a single mounted knight at the front of the gathered force. "That's an awful lot of priests, though." "Agreed," the captain said, and indicated the formation standing behind the priests, "and an unusually large gathering of wizards." "But not placed out of harm's way," the sergeant noted. "They'd be in the back and we'd already be burning if they intended to try and take us," the captain agreed. His eyes swept the gathering, but further observation was interrupted when the knight riding at the front of the priests rode forward. Raising his lance, he used the butt of it to knock on Caranth's iron-bound gates. "I'd better go and see what he wants," the captain said, pushing himself away from the parapet and hurrying back down the stairs. "You'd best follow, sergeant. It looks like the elves have come out of seclusion." "Yes, sir," the sergeant muttered, hurrying after him. Elves. Didn't they have enough trouble as it was? The rider raised his voice as they reached the courtyard. "We've come from the elven kingdom of Akrydor," he cried, "land of the elven nation of Lusuror. We come in peace." He paused, and the captain heard the lance strike the gates once more. We come to offer our assistance. Again he paused, unaware the captain had his hand on the postern gate. Pray the gods look favourable on us, he said, as their visitor spoke again. Bid your lord our most respectful greetings, and ask what hospitality he thinks closed gates represent. Hospitality, the captain muttered as he began to turn the handle. Sir, aren't they the elves who the sergeant began, only to have his captain cut him off. Told us to stay out of their forest and their affairs or face a war we couldn't afford, he snapped. Send a runner to Lord Endura. Tell him of the delegation and put the men on lower alert. I want no accidents now. Keeping his hand on the postern gate handle, he watched as the sergeant hurried toward the corporal, signalling a runner as he went. The sergeant's next order made him glad he was on duty. Have the men formed up and ready for inspection by the time the sun reaches the battlements, he ordered, before turning to the runner. The captain saw the corporal cast a glance his way, then stiffened to attention and carefully hid a smile. If the man did his job properly, not only would the men be too busy to create a diplomatic incident, but he would have an honour guard fitting enough to greet his lord's unexpected guest. Leaving the elf to stew while he waited for the Lord Endura's reply, the captain took his hand from the postern gate door, snapping his fingers to summon the two closest soldiers. Indicating the postern gate, he said, Guard it well. No one enters or leaves by this door until I have orders from our Lord Endura. Leaving the men to hurriedly take their positions, he stalked back across the courtyard to his office to wait. Behind him, he heard quickly muffled curses and the clatter of arms and armour as his men rushed to prepare for the inspection.